So you guys know that U.S. foreign policy is a monstrous fraud, right? For 20 years, Washington, D.C. has been lying to the American public to scare us into giving them more money. They've then taken that money to go and make the world much more dangerous. And now they're coming back to us and they're saying we need a lot more money because the world is so scary. The U.S. military-industrial complex has just completed its victory over another U.S. president. Let's get into it. The basic lie is simple, obvious, and almost never challenged. Washington, D.C. wants to convince us that the United States is in some kind of danger. We are not in any danger. We just aren't. This is a country bordered by two oceans and two countries, Canada and Mexico, whose main foreign policy agendas are further subordinating their economies to ours. We are the only country in the world that is capable of self-sufficiency, and we don't just have all the resources and technology needed for modern life. We invented most of it. We naturally run the world. And if we don't actively go out and fuck up the world, people automatically love us. Because we also invented modern marketing, and we happen to have a really appealing basic ideology. We will let anybody come here and call themselves American. In fact, we usually encourage it. Very few other places do that. If we just left the world alone, we could sit back and watch our power grow, decade by decade, as the world's best and brightest kept making their way here. The problem is that about 80 years ago, we created a massive military machine to crush our last two serious rivals, the Germans and the Japanese. And we spent 40 years after that crushing the Soviet Union, which was really only as powerful as it was because we had built it up to fight the Germans in World War II. After 80 years, this massive military machine we built owns most congresspeople, most U.S. universities, and almost all of the media. We are still a free country, but the $1 trillion+ we spend on the military every year deeply corrupts all the news and analysis of the outside world that we receive. So why is military spending so important to Washington, D.C.? Let me answer that question with a clip from one of my favorite videos from last year. The primary mission of the U.S. government throughout this century has been selling weapons. The defense industry is a surprisingly small part of the U.S. economy, but it's the most important part to Washington, D.C., because it's a business that is entirely government-controlled. There's a lot more money in tech, energy, finance, and other sectors, but those parts of the economy are unpredictable and vulnerable to competition and markets. With the defense industry, Congress has complete control and endless opportunities for corruption. So DC's highest priority is always keeping wars going and scaring the US public enough to keep defense budgets high. We US taxpayers allowed this to happen because we are so secure. What happens in Ukraine, Taiwan, or Israel is dramatically less important to our daily lives than whatever new TV show is on Netflix or HBO. Nothing really matters to us. The problem is that the experts we have signed our world management over to want more money, so they have to scare us. So they make the world worse. That's the basic fraud at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. A great example of this would be 9/11. The U.S. had won the Cold War by the 1950s. It was only an escalating series of U.S. mistakes, chiefly Vietnam, that kept the Soviets looking at all viable. One of these mistakes was Saudi Arabia, a medieval monarchy with a gross corruption of Islamic ideology that the U.S. foreign policy establishment heavily supported, up to and beyond the point that that ideology created a smoking crater in Lower Manhattan. To get justice for 9/11, we didn't have to attack Saudi Arabia, we just had to stop propping it up and let it fall. That would have made for a much better, much safer world. But that's the exact opposite of what Washington, D.C. wants. So they tried this nonsense instead.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
The only correct, moral, and just thing to do after 9/11 was let Saudi Arabia fall or facilitate that fall through prosecutions in U.S. courts. But that wouldn't give Washington, D.C.'s precious military anything to do. So instead, they ludicrously tried to knit these three loser regimes into some kind of broad conspiracy that we could use our military against. Let's take a look at how that went, huh? Well, first there is North Korea, a batshit little despotism that in 2002 was dependent on a Clinton-era deal with the United States to feed itself. The deal was that we gave them access to enough trade and money to barely sustain the country, and in return they wouldn't go nuclear. Bush's tough guys ended that program in 2002, called North Korea evil, and by 2006 North Korea became a nuclear power we could never conquer, but would always have to buy weapons to potentially fight. Big success for the defense contractors and nobody else. Iran had been desperately trying to come in from the cold since the early 1990s. They invited U.S. oil companies back in during the Clinton administration, but the U.S. military-industrial complex refused to let one of their last and most lucrative enemies make peace, and they killed the deal. After 9/11, Iran was instrumental in helping the United States take Afghanistan, hoping that they could ally with Washington, D.C. against Sunni terror. Instead, Bush called them evil and then handed them Iraq on a silver platter. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had been utterly crushed in the early 1990s and was desperate for whatever crumbs the international community was willing to give them. Saddam Hussein posed no threat to the United States or anybody other than his own people, but the Bushies were desperate to show what the U.S. military could do. They sure showed us, killing 600,000 Iraqis to build a country where most people are still worse off than they were under Saddam. Oh, and it's also worth mentioning, in light of recent events, that the Bush losers gave Gaza to Hamas as well. They pushed an election in 2006 that brought Hamas to power. Appalled at what they had done, the Bush administration then ended Palestinian democracy by funding and arming a civil war that permanently split the Palestinian Authority and gave Hamas the excuse to take full dictatorial control of Gaza in 2007. They've been there ever since, with horrific results. Bush also tripled Mexico's murder rate through an ill-advised militarization of the drug war and restarted the war in Somalia. He was a busy guy. It is customary and sane to look at the Bush era as a horrific failure, but I'm afraid that the people in power in Washington, D.C. see the Bush era as the good old days. They're still using Bush's playbook, and they get really, really angry when U.S. presidents don't want to follow that playbook. Washington, D.C. takes regimes and conflicts that need a few $1 million of diplomacy and turns them into sources of trillions of dollars of profit for weapons companies. That's a key thing to understand about the fraud perpetrated by the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The world absolutely is getting more dangerous, so it's tempting to say, oh well, better give the Pentagon more money. But it is hyper-militarized U.S. foreign policy that makes the world more dangerous. And the more money we give them, the worse the world will get. George W. Bush was a pure avatar of evil and destruction, making ruin everywhere he went while spouting Christian platitudes. But all three presidents since Bush have worked pretty hard to try to overturn his legacy. They have all failed miserably. U.S. presidents are still, just barely, accountable to the people, and the past three presidents could see the wreckage Bush had made, and see that continuously pouring trillions down that black hole was in no way in the interest of the American people. Barack Obama was the first to try and fail to fix the damage. Don't get me wrong, Obama did many horrible things. Destroying Libya wrecked North Africa for a decade. Creating a wide-open field for jihadis in northern Syria gave us the Islamic State, which then required bombing cities to rubble to stamp out the Islamic State. He allowed Saudi Arabia's ridiculous and failed invasion of Yemen. Obama supported the overthrow of a democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014, prompting a Russian invasion. All of these things provided massive cash infusions to Washington, D.C. and the defense contractors that own Washington, D.C. I think Obama told himself that if he did these things and satisfied the voracious beast that is Washington, D.C. and managed to keep U.S. troops out of it, then maybe he'd finally be able to start making peace with Iran and begin to extricate the United States from the Middle East. That's a good idea, and it was a noble effort, but it was always likely to fail. Washington, D.C. was refusing to honor any of the terms of the deal long before Donald Trump got elected and killed it. Most people in Washington, D.C. will agree with me that Obama was a failure in foreign policy. But it's not because of all the countries he destroyed. Washington, D.C. hates Obama because he didn't destroy enough. The biggest complaint they have against him is that he didn't ruinously invade Syria the way Bush invaded Iraq. That may sound insane, but that's what every serious foreign policy expert is saying when they complain about Obama's refusal to back up his red line in Syria. They wanted another Iraq. Donald Trump became U.S. president for a lot of bad reasons, but also for one very good one. He was the only viable presidential candidate this century to tell the truth about what Washington, D.C. had done to the world and what it had done to the U.S. taxpayer.
We have done a tremendous disservice, not only to the Middle East, we've done a tremendous disservice to humanity. The people that have been killed, the people that have been wiped away, and for what? It's not like we had victory. It's a mess. The Middle East is totally destabilized, a total and complete mess. I wish we had the $4 trillion or $5 trillion. I wish it was spent right here in the United States on our schools, hospitals, roads, airports, and everything else that are all falling apart.
Unfortunately, Donald Trump was also Donald Trump, a monster of self-regard, a reality TV show star pretending to be a businessman. Obviously, he was utterly incapable of running the U.S. government. The military-industrial complex ran rings around it. While we all watched the President Trump show in horror, the U.S. foreign policy establishment openly changed its focus, away from its massively failed war on terror to starting wars with Russia and China, which were the fights the Pentagon had wanted all along anyway. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's in the 2018 National Security Strategy, which openly shifted us towards great power competition. George W. Bush's national security state failures had become our resistance heroes against Trump, so nobody even questioned it. Ukraine is paying the price for that today, and Taiwan is likely to pay the price for it as well in the not-too-distant future. China and Russia were ready for great power competition as well, not because of some inherent evil or lust for empire, but because of 15 solid years of U.S. aggression. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and their systems spent the 1990s and 2000s tying themselves in knots to try to fit into the U.S. system. By 2015, NATO expansion and the U.S. militarization of Asia had made it damn clear that Russia and China would never be accepted by the U.S. as equals. There's a key part of this that always gets neglected. Washington, D.C. seems to pretend that China and Russia just decided to be evil one day. This entirely neglects the fact that the United States spent 2 decades destroying the Middle East and North Africa, in the process steamrolling a lot of Russian and Chinese interests. We made it damn clear that the world's most powerful country would accept no peaceful rivalry. Russia and China are more hostile today, but that's self-defense on their part, not aggression. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is unforgivable, but he learned that sort of behavior from watching us. Trump was one of the weakest presidents in U.S. history. He ordered that U.S. troops be taken out of Syria at least 3 times. He was ignored. The newest issue of the Atlantic Monthly has a cover article celebrating Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who worked with hundreds of others to routinely violate the orders of our democratically elected commander-in-chief. Some of those orders probably were worth ignoring, but that shouldn't make you any less worried about the U.S. Constitution. Domestically, the main impact of the Trump era was to turn what was left of the liberal media into bloodthirsty militarists. Abroad, despite Trump's friendly rhetoric, in part because of it, U.S. attempts to destroy Russia went into overdrive. Under Trump, all attempts at a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine crisis were abandoned. The U.S. started sanctioning any country that bought weapons from Russia, a country that is vastly more dependent on its military-industrial complex than we are. And we started massively arming up Ukraine. Putin's horrific invasion is inexcusable. but it's not hard to see why he thought he had no other choice. Biden presented a new opportunity for peace, maybe the last one. Unlike Trump and Obama, he had decades of experience of Washington, D.C. He had experienced decades of lying generals, all the way back to the Vietnam era, and much more recently with the failed Afghanistan surge he had opposed in the early Obama years. He had the experience and the Congress wrangling skills he needed to tame the military-industrial complex. In his first year, Joe Biden got to work. He took us out of Afghanistan, finally ending that 20-year-long misbegotten adventure. Getting out of Afghanistan is probably the only legitimately heroic act by a U.S. president this century. And he was punished for it by the U.S. media that proceeded to use Afghanistan to murder his presidency. Instead of focusing on 20 years of failure or the general's near-treasonous refusal to prepare for an orderly withdrawal that two presidents had ordered, the military-industrial complex media made Biden the bad guy. This smear campaign successfully drove Biden's approval ratings down to below Trump levels, and they've never really recovered. The constant accusations of wimpiness and cowardice meant that Biden was incapable of engaging with Russia in any meaningful way. The Democratic base wanted Russian blood, and Putin and Biden delivered, with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians caught in the crossfire. Biden has handled the Ukraine war, a war he probably didn't want, admirably well, despite his flagging popularity and his fading capacities. I think his steady hand on the escalation lever may have kept us out of World War III. But he's also overseen a massive U.S. remilitarization of Europe that will probably last a generation, if not generations. Biden kept on trying to reach out diplomatically to China and the global South. He had failed to keep Europe out of war, but with expanded global outreach, perhaps he could keep us out of war with Iran and China. He attempted this in ways both very positive and deeply misguided. His quiet ending, or at least slowing down, of most of Obama's drone wars was a great gift to a generation of the world's poorest people who had learned to fear death from the skies. The U.S. media and most of Congress tied his hands with Iran, but by backing off Trump's program of piracy against Iranian oil, he made peace look possible. These were good things. Biden's attempt to continue Trump's absurd Abraham Accords policy was not a good thing. In fact, as we now know, it was catastrophic. Making deals with Arab autocrats to sideline the Palestinians backfired horrifically. And it's with that horrific Palestinian revenge and the apocalyptic Israeli response that I think we can stop talking about Joe Biden as any kind of improvement. The military-industrial complex has conquered another U.S. president. Biden's moral and humane victory over the international drone war has been wiped out in just a month of Israeli bombing. The U.S.-sponsored piles of dead women and children are centralized in one country now, but that just makes them easier to see. Biden's pretensions of humanitarian leadership have been squashed by his firm support for an Israeli government that is openly attempting ethnic cleansing. Biden's complete surrender to U.S. empire's monstrous fraud was symbolized by a speech he gave a couple weeks back that fell all the way down to below George W. Bush's level.
It's sick. Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it.
The absurdity of Bush's axis of evil speech was that he tried to staple together three regimes that had almost nothing to do with each other. He totally got away with it. But at least Bush's three countries were all nation-states. Biden's attempt to put a separatist group within one of our client states on the same level as the fated imperial power that is Russia goes beyond absurdity to obscenity. There's a serious danger that the population of Gaza will be ethnically cleansed by a vastly superior military force in the coming months. A U.S. president attempting to put Gaza's gross little quasi-government on the same level as Putin's neo-imperial nuclear power makes the horrific possibility of genocide much more real. Bush's axis of evil speech was a catastrophe, but we could at least be confident that the three targeted countries would still exist once the U.S. military-industrial complex was done with them. Biden has taken Bush's rhetorical absurdity and added a slice of potential genocide to it. Frankly, it's nauseating. As with Obama and even Trump, it's possible to have some sympathy for Biden's defeat by Washington, D.C.'s great fraud. All three men tried, but all three were utterly defeated by a Congress, a media, and legions of lobbyists that are wholly owned by the U.S. arms industry. We can be sympathetic, but that does not mean we can stop fighting. Because after breaking the world and conquering their third U.S. president in a row, the military-industrial complex is now coming for the American people. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's been laid out explicitly in the pages of Foreign Affairs magazine. Robert Gates is maybe the most respected and influential man in U.S. foreign policy. When Bush realized he needed one of Daddy's Cold Warriors to clean up his mess, he looked to Gates in 2006. He is seen as a very bipartisan figure because Obama kept him on as Secretary of Defense for a couple of years. Because media and government lie to us constantly, the Iraq and Afghanistan surges that Gates oversaw are still seen as successes. So Gates isn't just a bipartisan foreign policy figure, he's seen as a successful one. And those are in really short supply in the United States. So the most influential guy in the U.S. military-industrial complex just released a foreign policy manifesto in which he declared war on the American people, specifically your parents and grandparents. It's this Foreign Affairs article that convinced me I needed to make this video. Gates does a decent job of describing some of the ways the world has gotten more dangerous, but in the true Washington, D.C. fraud style, he completely leaves out U.S. responsibility. He claims that what we really need is to dump another $1 trillion a year into the U.S. military spending that has done so much to make the world more dangerous. And how should we pay for it? By strip mining Medicare and Social Security, robbing the American people of what little social safety net we have. This Robert Gates article made me so angry that I dedicated 2 episodes of the podcast to it. You can find those episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts now, and on our other YouTube channel in a few weeks' time. Today I've attempted to lay out the true history of the past 20 years and what Washington, D.C. has done to the world. The worst thing about all this is that none of it was necessary. 80 years ago, U.S. military victory gave the world the best chance for a lasting peace that it had ever had. I still believe that U.S. military strength is necessary to maintain that peace. But it's also true that U.S. military hyperactivity and the many frauds that are used to justify that hyperactivity are the greatest threat to world peace. It's the very definition of a tragedy.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.